different things on my mind, so I kind of have to talk through the swarm of it before I feel like I can be more precise or coherent, I guess. So let's start in. It kind of reminds me of, so there's this verse and I forget exactly where it's at, and I actually forget the entire context around it. But it kind of lingers in my mind a little. And it's this portion where the Apostle Paul is like, I'll just have to summarize it. Something to the effect of like, he kind of laments that he wishes that he can just how would you say it? Reach some type of breakthrough with other groups of Israel. Because he just kind of really believes in the direction of things shifting, and he really laments and basically like wishes that they would recognize the direction he's trying to reveal, I guess you could say. And it almost comes across as like a warning, like things are shifting in this way, and I really wish that you would recognize it for your sake and not just my sake, like that. Like he laments about it. So I think about that sometimes, and I remember thinking about that years and years ago, like several years ago, when I went through these stages. Well, first of all, let me say this. People have to really recognize and understand that. So for me, I interpret a lot of the scriptures through the lens of the stage of Jesus. I guess people would call that like Christianity. The idea of Christ, like the word Christ, is like the anointed one, the Messiah, the stage of revelation, a certain benchmark. Like there could be previous messiahs, but there's, so there's stages of revelation. Once you hit a stage of revelation, it kind of encapsulates the previous stages and then keeps going forward. And so you could even say, in a sense, like Moses was a stage of Messiah, various leaders were a stage of Messiah, or like a Christ or a type of Christ, or like in the book of Job, it says like almost like the ransoming spirit or something to that effect. The thing that creates the next stage points toward the next stage in the midst of not knowing between different things. So it talks about that in the book of Job. Right? And I had shared, I generally tend to read the book of Job as the sense of the experience where people become confused between the stage of religion and then the transitional stage pointing towards spiritual growth, or the next stage of like spiritual health. And people might say, so I can imagine Christians would say, well, you make it seem like Jesus isn't unique, though, when you explain it that way, that Jesus is just another spiritual teacher. That's not really what I'm saying. Jesus makes sense and is defined within a certain tradition. And so it makes sense to say, well, how is it defined within that tradition? So that's what I'm talking about in reference to defining these certain patterns within like Judaism, Christianity, and then later Islam connects itself to these like spiritual traditions as well. And so along those lines, then, I'm just saying that when I interpret scripture, so this is important, I usually interpret through the lens of that stage, acknowledging the stage of revelation of Jesus pertaining to the whole story. And I think it's important for other people to recognize that too. And so when, from the Christian lens of things, when people then make reference to stories through the Hebrew text or the Old Testament, or even the use of, say, like Israel, it's very similar in the sense of taking it from the lens of the stage of Jesus, from a Christian context. Take, for instance, like if a Christian makes reference to David and Goliath, even though it's like an older story, they're not referencing it in the sequence of those stages. It's often referenced through the lens of Jesus, through the culmination of just kind of like a likeness of overcoming and stuff like that. Overcoming with great odds against you, things like that. And so obviously for me, I kind of have this peculiar experience with Christianity where, as a Native person in the Americas, I have a different way of looking at Christianity, while at the same time I've had experiences of being within the tradition of like a spiritual expression of Christianity. And so because of that, I don't always agree with certain approaches or interpretations. Whereas at the same time, I also understand people are at different stages of growth. And so I also have to kind of discern their personal spiritual growth. And so this is also why I've gotten into what I would call like systems theory, where it can kind of help people see where they're at in the grand scheme of things. There's a lot more to it, but anyway, so along those lines, when I'm thinking of this passage of Paul, when he's talking about this difficulty that he's having because he's kind of growing spiritually outside of the traditional or the church at the time. And so if you're not familiar, a general summary with the Apostle Paul is that he wasn't among the disciples of Jesus. He didn't know Jesus in that same type of way. And so some people discredit Paul, say like he's not really a part of the gospel story. He's not one of the disciples. He attached himself to the movement later and was initially actually persecuting the movement. He was like a zealous Israelite, and he was trying to stop the Christian movement, even getting some of the prominent figures stoned to death for blasphemy and whatnot. And so, of course, the Christian disciples are not going to trust him at first. And so there's this tension between the Apostle Paul and the disciples, and especially he and Peter, because Peter's kind of helping guide that movement. It's interesting too, because I was just listening to, recently listening to Reza Aslan. He's a religious scholar, and he authored the book explaining some of the history of Islam, the story of Islam, and it's called No God But God. And then he also wrote the book Zealot, the story of Jesus and some of the other sides of Jesus. And he recently was in a interview. Gosh, I forget what the show is called. But something that he had mentioned, which I found interesting, and I never thought to consider it. I mean, I guess it's kind of there lingering, but he was saying how some people discredit Paul, I mean, I've heard this a lot. The Apostle Paul's teachings are a difficult stage of things. But he was kind of saying how the Apostle Paul didn't reference Jesus' teachings. That he kind of builds this other like spiritual teaching alongside these other teachings, and he's a little bit at odds with the other disciples. And it kind of caused me to think, and I was imagining, because I generally like some of the challenge that Apostle Paul has. And one of the books that I find really interesting, which some people dispute, and so I don't know that it was actually written by the Apostle Paul, but like the book of Hebrews, it's in question. People say it's not written by the Apostle Paul. Like I said, it's in question. But I'm also including that one within the curiosity of the movement that Paul seemed to be about. It seems like a somewhat connection to it. But anyway, it kind of had me thinking because you're imagining, because that's like us today, right? Like, how do some of these spiritual movements and adjacent movements keep going when so many people have not literally or physically experienced being among various ones, and it just keeps going, But anyway, I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, if you imagine some of the stuff that Paul did experience, I mean, I'm sure in the whole region there was a certain form of awareness of some movements and stuff going on. But I was thinking, well, some of the stuff that Paul was exposed to that influenced his stage of spiritual confrontation and movement and this whole shift that he eventually becomes a part, is that he was there because he was kind of in charge of the stoning of Stephen. And at that time, Stephen gives almost like a mini sermon, and some of the things that he says in that moment, you would imagine influenced Paul. And it was kind of like Stephen's dying last words, right? And then he still didn't have a conversion moment, though. It was probably something where it intensified his resistance and angered him, because at some point when you're opposing a spiritual change or like a spiritual breakthrough, even if you receive spiritual insight, you will become more angry. But I'm sure that it somehow resonated with him. So there's that experience, and then because he was on such a rampage, it was likely that he knew about the accusations and the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus, and then wanting to stop the movement afterwards. And then there's question as to like some strange occurrences intersected at that time. So there was a strange series of events, but he still didn't convert, right? So he must have known of the public occurrence of the trial and the crucifixion, or the sentencing of crucifixion. That's important to say, because these days, as we're negotiating with other religious scholars, people are talking about the descriptive words of, or like enacting the crucifixion. But anyway, that's for another conversation. So the crucifixion and the testimony of Stephen, and then later, a huge part of his spiritual journey is that major confrontation, right? He has that spiritual conversion, and they call it like on the road to Damascus. He has this encounter with this spiritual being that kind of stops him in his tracks. There's different descriptions of the story, But those are his experiences, right? And then from there, he develops this next stage of interpreting this whole Jesus movement. And then he becomes eventually like a very pivotal character in carrying this movement forward. Some will even say that it's because of him that we even think of Christianity today. He strategized and brought it into certain places at the time, strategically, when Rome was going through some tumult and shifting, and he kind of placed it right in the center where it would go out into many directions. And people struggle and kind of wrestle over some of his teachings and whatnot and interpretations. And there's different degrees of it, just like any kind of religious practice, where people will be exacting on some stuff and not look at it in the cultural context. Some people will kind of look at it in a variety of different ways. But anyway, so here we are. Here's the Apostle Paul, right? This character. The disciples were apprehensive of him. Some of them outright didn't like him. Some thought he was misreading the movement and going beyond the church. All of these things, right? So anyway, there's this portion, and I believe it's Paul. I'm going to say it's Paul. I'm just kind of going off memory and experience and whatnot. I'm like 99% sure it's Paul. He says something, because it fits his story. In these stories, like all these jumbled up stories, he says something like that lament, right? Like, now that he has this breakthrough, and he realizes, like, oh, the tides have turned. There's a shift going on. And we do have to kind of shift in this direction where things are going. And this movement and whatnot. And so then he says, so he's kind of caught between worlds, right? He's caught between the Israelites, the Jewish groups, and then he's also like, there's this tension within different factions of the church groups, the Christian movement. And he says something to the effect of like, so he's kind of seeming to lament about it and saying something like, how I would long to like draw you to me, or something to that effect, but like kind of heeding the direction of things occurring. But he realizes at some point that obviously 100% that's not going to happen. And it's kind of one of those peculiar moments when you're kind of dealing with religion, and it kind of goes back to that topic, the intersecting of religion and spirituality, where religious practice is good, but if you're not in the direction of where things are going, then it could be counterproductive, right? Anyway, let's just kind of skip forward and not go through this whole long story. But so people kind of familiar then recognized there was just kind of a morphing into where the direction of some of these movements would go. And that's not to say that some people aren't called to kind of go in slightly different directions, because the more you kind of recognize, and this goes back to the systems theory type approach, things morph and they move within units, and not everybody is going to be doing the exact same thing at the exact same time or adhering to different stages. You have to kind of keep the various portions of a movement going, and so that just means different people do different things or are called to do different things at different times. But at some functional level, there should be some recognition of like picking your battles properly, or not fighting the wrong battles in the midst of major shift, or at least the ability to recognize that. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, like for me, let's just say I recognize within religion there's a lot of different denominations or variations, and there's just going to be times where there's some battles I'm not going to pick, or it's not the, like some issues are not like the main issue. You kind of have to discern between what are some of the main factors or the areas of the most concern to focus on, things along those lines, and kind of let various ones be, right? Anyway, I was saying I had a lot of things on my mind, right? So that's kind of one little lingering thing. In the midst of that, some other things just kind of thinking about, and it goes along with this, is this topic how I had mentioned before, and I heard about this before and talked about it before, where people are saying in terms of patterns on the world stage and the stage of progress and the stage of consciousness of people and the network and the connection, that they kind of describe this stage, this historic stage, as more of a preliminary, or maybe not so much preliminary, because it seemed to start at the end of like Jesus's movement, like the last stage that he made reference to, is that it's the spiritual stage, that it's marked as like maybe the mystic stage, the spiritual stage, and that some of the stories seem to suggest that it would kind of be carried forth in the midst of everything else to like grow together. And so until eventually something, right? Like the question mark something. Like a lot of these religious beliefs are always like open-ended. Like there's something unresolved, the story's not done. That kind of thing. Like we're not done with the movie yet. And so what they seem to suggest is that some of these little inclinations of the spiritual connotation grow among various other movements and groups, and it grows together. And so it becomes this network of all of these things like grown together. Then the question there would be, until when, though? Like, what's the indicator? Like, grow together until when? And so that's where people kind of question, like, well, until Jesus comes back, or until there's a major battle, or until, so people suppose, like, what's the point of, okay, we've reached the fullness of this, like, knitting together this movement in all these different pockets, what have you. And what it seems like is, for those that don't think like it has to be initiated by some battle, or it has to be initiated by something or other, like Jesus coming back, or things like that, because then the motivation is like, well, what do we do then in the meantime? We're just waiting for a battle, or we're just waiting for Jesus to come back. So that's why I don't really think that it's those things. It seems like what the indicator is, and you find this in the stories, that until it reaches the ends of the earth, right? Until it gets embedded and intertwined to the quote-unquote ends of the earth. Basically like reaching full mass on the world stage, the world network. And that seems to make sense to me. If you're looking at a story that started in terms of wanting to transform the earth, and that there was a certain level of consciousness intertwined in it that would cause there to be a faulty sense of alignment to it, you would think that the movement set in motion to counteract that would then be indicated by reaching the ends of the earth, networked and set up across the world connections. So that's interesting to think about. Because we're kind of at that stage, right? We've reached globalization. We've reached world network connection. What I also find interesting, so if some of you have followed my stuff years back, you know that I've made reference to this writing piece that I just had this personal experience with several years back. It's this whole story that I didn't even know how to look for it. It kind of fell into my life path at a certain moment. Like I said, it's a whole story. But it's a speech given by Martin Luther King Jr. It's called Remaining Awake During the Great Revolution. What's interesting about that is, we think of time sequences where we would think like modern history. Sometimes we think in just like the past 10 years or so. But actually, you can kind of pan out and look at it as like the last 100 or the last 50 is actually pretty recent history, right? So even though it might seem like a while ago, it's still very recent history. That still is part of the human chapter that we find ourselves in now. It's still part of this chapter that humanity is in. Especially on the world stage, especially as pertaining to the US and its influence globally. And its influence spiritually and religiously, and pertaining to mankind and its potential. And so what's interesting about that, it's a speech, but I listened to it on audio and then I printed it out, and so I read it. And in that, you see Martin Luther King Jr. document this time as being this great revolution that we're living amongst, and he calls it like a technological and innovative stage of humanity where we've created of the world a neighborhood, but we have not yet broken into creating it as like a spiritual brotherhood. And we have all these other factors and limitations and obstructions between shifting into a better mankind, right? So basically, though, he's explaining that it's at that time we were reaching the stage of globalization. And of course it resonated with me because I've been doing these studies that I'd call systems theory and looking at things in these like big units and systems and nations and whatnot. And so even now, when we look at the time of COVID, right, we also recognize that to be so true. We're a world neighborhood. We all live downriver. And like in that speech, it says like what affects one person. Like we are an inescapable network of mutuality. What affects one person will affect another person. And we see that with COVID. We see that through technological advancements, we are connected, we're networked. And so our actions influence each other and has ripple effects among each other. And so now that we're realizing that on a global scale, we're also realizing we need to figure out this brotherhood thing, this spiritual brotherhood thing. And so I'm thinking about this as well, right? And I'm thinking about this stage of humanity and globalization and the network, and it's at that stage, and we had this call that there would be this spiritual movement that would just network throughout the world and then reach global mass, right? But then what? And so something that I've also had on my mind, because obviously if you follow my stuff, my contribution to this comes from being a Native person in the Americas, and the history and looking at it on the world stage, and similar to Martin Luther King Jr., I also have this like Christian heritage and influence and complex relationship to the United States. And what does that mean to interpret Christianity along those lines of a spirit of connection to life and truth? And so just thinking about these things, right? And so the other day, and I'm talking myself through this because I just don't have time to do all things right now, all studies and all preparations that I feel like I should, or if I could, I would. But it's just right now easier to talk through it and just kind of be humble that I can say I feel like I'm not exactly equipped enough to talk on it yet, but I'm just going to talk through it. I keep thinking that eventually I'll get to this point where I'm more prepared to negotiate between some of the stuff we've brought up on some areas on social media having to do with like Islam and Christianity and the US and Israel, all of these things, right? And among those connections is really important that I bring up my own cultural experience, and among one of those influences is something that I tend to bring up, or I brought up in the past, where I say, there's this different path of Christianity that is not necessarily, it's not entirely separate from some other portions of Christianity, but it's a different spiritual path, and it's a different occurrence that is not always spoken about in prominent U.S. history or religious recognition. And I think when you look back, it's because people just couldn't hear it yet, maybe. They didn't have a framework to understand these other ways of looking at how God works among people in the midst of world systems and world powers that oftentimes are more prevailing in terms of like how people frame their interpretation of what God is like and whatnot. But there's these other lingering stories that are not always told about, these testimonies of what was actually happening, and these like lingering stories with having to do with Christianity and this peculiar theory of Jesus and this strange spiritual networking that was happening. And I've been meaning to do more of a study on that, to be, have the papers and the quotes and the references in front of me. But at this point, I think I'm just going to talk about it, because there are people out there that have the info, that know these things, that have been studying them more equipped than I am, and just don't always have the platform, I guess you would say. But what's interesting is in the midst of these powerful systems that were just expanding across the globe, also accompanied with various interpretations that people have, levels of propaganda, other things, what have you, powerful world markets that inevitably spoke a lot louder than spiritual movements. Like even Martin Luther King Jr. seems to make reference to, in seeking for testimony of mutuality, you could look at markets and what people had done. And how it doesn't always speak to recognizing the a life-giving spirit of humanity, that kind of thing. So we're talking about the dominant system expansion and intertwined with certain interpretations of how life works, how God works, and is that even true? And so what's lingering in these stories and testimonies that I was making reference to is there were among various holy men or holy people that did have certain spiritual experiences that preceded some levels of contact, like with settlers and whatnot. And so they were having these spiritual experiences in these various places, various tribes. And basically kind of like preparation that certain people would be arriving and to be receptive to kind of like a trade of ideas, and there would be a spiritual connotation to it and stuff like that. I just feel like the more I started to learn about some of those sides of history, then I started to be a little bit more encouraged as to like recognizing a difference between how God works and how we understand how God works, and how the way that God works is not always like the prominent story that's told of certain things going on. And anyway, so among those stories are just various like holy men and people that were receptive in their prayer to these expecting these certain opportunities to trade ideas and grow into a sense of spiritual mutuality. And accompanying these trade of ideas would be a book. And there's even stories similar to this, like I've read the story like in South America, there was some connotations of this as well, that some of their holy men also had these spiritual experiences, and it was to recognize the arrival of like a book. And I believe in South America tribes, it was they didn't know it was a book. They discerned later that it was possibly a book because it was a vision of some kind of book, but they didn't have books. And so when they were discerning between there was this missionary that went there with a different approach than kind of just more spiritually receptive. He developed relationships with them, and he was speaking to various ones, and then through this developing relationships, eventually they shared that there was this prophecy. And so it was as though they were kind of asking him if any of that was in reference. Anyway, they started to figure out there was this unresolved prophecy, and it had something to do with like what they called banana leaves prophecy, or they were asking him if he had known. And see, I don't know what these look like. I just read the story. Like, I haven't been in areas where bananas just grow naturally, but I guess, like, as they described, there's a certain way that the leaves stack up, I guess, and sometimes when they fall to the ground, the side of them, when it's like tilted to the side, looks like a book. And if I also remember the story correctly, it's been a long time, the guy didn't even put two and two together until he had really gone through such a difficult time, and he, I think, was lost in the forest or something happened and he became ill, or I don't know, he went through a lot of difficulty trying to develop these relationships, and he found himself basically like floored, which, you know, people that actually do the difficult work of developing these types of connections and relationships and developing your lives can probably resonate with that. There's times where it's just doing some of these things is not easy. He finds himself out in an isolated area, and I think maybe he's laying on the ground or something. There's so many different stories that he'd gone through, and he kind of glances over. I think he's kind of exhausted at this time, And he just so happens to have either kicked or bumped like some banana leaves. And it's like tilted to the side to where he could see it. And then he's like, oh man, like it's a book. It's a book. Their prophecy is a book. And I think this is before, I forget the time sequence that he even shows them the Bible or anything like that. Because it probably wasn't even like relevant at the time. And he shows it to them and he pulls it out to them. He shows it to them side by side. And so they realize like they start building that relationship. And I guess like the banana leaves look like the book. And so they start developing this relationship. And they start kind of learning into, because he studies a lot of different languages. And so he knows, he's really good at picking up on languages. So at this time, he's able to like speak their language and whatnot. And they share ideas, and then eventually they're curious, like, well, what are some of these stories then? Like, what is it? Like, so he explains about the stories. And he can't really say. So he's like trying to learn how to like cross-reference the stories, like make it applicable to their lives. And so he's trying to explain, like, well, Jesus encapsulates this relationship and like moves into these communities and helps the people to understand about God and stuff like that. And he's kind of making some progress. And so then someone else chimes in and says, oh, that's like of course they're saying this differently, not as flippantly as I'm trying to summarize it, but like, oh, that's like the ant story. And they're like, yeah, that's the ant story. And so then they explain to him, well, the ant story is, there's the ants that we have here, and the creator was trying to like teach the ants or something to this effect. It's like I said, it's been a long time. The creator then manifests among the ants, and through that then teaches the ants how to build mound homes, and because of the climate in that culture, to make these certain homes in such a way for like their life, to build their life. And there's other references to it, and then he says, and that's how their people had learned to build their homes, that it was like a revelation from the creator, teaching them how to build their homes. There's more to it. I feel like I didn't explain that as well. But the point is that they were learning to make these references of communication through their culture, through spiritual expectation that they had through various prophecies and whatnot. And I remember several years back when I read that, I found it really interesting, because there are some people that do that. There are some people that approach other groups and they have expectation to find that spark of God, to share mutually, to spiritually edify each other, to recognize seeing God through the lens of their lives. And then they help people to kind of bridge that understanding and whatnot. And I just found it a really cool story. It's still one of those stages where you could read old stories and you see the benefit of it at the time. There's a lot of other references that they culturally apply and grow and develop among each other. And even though I could see God doing that, like I could see, there's definitely seems to be some spiritual growth there. It also doesn't mean that, because this was like several years ago, probably time ago. And I'm sure that, so even if there are these little glimpses of these networks taking place, it also doesn't mean that just because that happens that person, say this missionary, was 100% accurate in his theology or interpretation. But it does mean that he could be used to develop those relationships and that there could still be something there. I think that's important to know because we still have that today, right? Like there could be stages where we're in the moment, where we're spiritually receptive and we're doing that work to build relationships, and that's our intent. And that's could be occurring at some level, but it doesn't mean that everything that I do or that someone else does is 100% accurate in terms of like the fullness of revelation. So we have to keep refining that. We have to keep developing relationships and keep having truth revealed to us more and more and more as we go through our lives and whatnot. And it's just good to remember that, to be humble about levels of understanding. So anyway, along those lines, there's also these other stories among tribes in the context of their culture where they were developing these abilities for these mutual trade of ideas. We don't always see these stories though, because what's more pervasive has been kind of like the world market, the world expansion. And so usually like the world expansion and the world market takes precedence over these vulnerable negotiations among various pockets of tribes and people and nations across the world. But what seems distinct nowadays is, as I was saying, these were when groups were filling the earth, expanding across the globe, some in gentler ways than others, some in just outright horrific ways. But what seems different now is that we're kind of at that fullness, right? There's nowhere else to really go except kind of deeper into relationship, deeper within examining how to refine it all into another like layer of spiritual receptivity and cohesiveness, and so we kind of seem like we're at that stage where the world is in gridlock, and so there's kind of this battle for where this level of the powers of the expansion goes, what's got to give, what does it look like for the future, and that kind of thing. But yeah, I was thinking about this, and some of the stories here and pretty close to this region was this other prophecy, and I've heard about it, and I'm pretty sure in one of the books I've read about it, and it's just always been in the back of my mind, like, okay, eventually I'll get to that and I'll do more of like a thorough study on it. Amongst these others, and I was kind of imagining I would get all these like tribal stories and the holy men and their little testimonies and prophecies together, and we'll look through and maybe map out the direction of expansion and what was happening at the time, and different missionaries or allies that were a part of it, and trying to like build this project of like an alternative path of connection, and maybe so I just had this kind of in the back of my mind for a while. I'm thinking like eventually we'll get there, but things are happening now in like a social media age so rapidly, so fast, that I just can't always just sit and deliver information in more of that controlled, refined delivery, right? So the other day I was working on some other stuff and my eye caught this book, and it was kind of about prophecy in the area. So I grabbed it and I thought, well, I'm kind of really drawn to that. Maybe it's time for me to start looking into that. So I put it in my pile of books to read, like closer to the nightstand and whatnot. And so just keep thinking about it till finally the other day I was like skimming it, because I've been trying to do a variety of other things. And so I was skimming it and I came across this quote that I had read a long time ago. And I forget exactly because I don't have the book in front of me right now. But it's a quote from one of the Spokane tribes. And it says something to the effect of eventually people would arrive in the territory or something and bring with them like a message or a testimony, maybe something in reference to a book or something to that effect, because this was like expansion had already started across like North America, and so this was kind of, I'd have to look at the time frame, but anyway, it's something to the effect of the message would reach up to this point and be shared among the people, and then after that the world would fall apart. But it said something in reference to the message, receiving the message, delivering the message, or interpreting the message, or something like that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I mean, we do have a lot of like Indigenous prophecies where it talks about it's not always going to be this terrible, and then eventually there's going to be some type of like breakthrough and some sort of like spiritual redemption and spiritual concurring to the humanity of Native people and Indigenous people, and a revelation about God, and things like that to that effect. But I just found it interesting, like years back when I was starting to study this stuff, and it was just kind of like circling in my experience, and I was kind of just looking at just kind of looking at things in a systemic way, globalization, where do we go now? And then I started noticing in other like spiritual circles, even among like various Christian groups and other groups, they were saying, we're feeling like things are changing, like people are going through something. So there was all this converging of these experiences where people were talking about no longer just going outward, but like going inward or going deeper, or a stage of transformation and not just expansion. And so it's just kind of interesting to start seeing all these like little pieces of people's similar experience overlapping. I think a lot of times when people hear some of these prophecies, they tend to just think it has to be like a doomsday, like apocalyptic, in the sense of like it'll end in a war, or it'll end in a battle, or it has to end in a war, or it has to end in a battle, or what does it mean by the world will, it'll reach this point and then the message will go out and the world will fall apart, or like what does this mean? What's also interesting is that in the midst of these movements that have been happening, there's these little hints of like I said, like similarity in what people are saying. There's a lot of talk about things like the husk or the cocoon or the, all of these other things. And then I had this experience where I was developing language of the systems theory. And so eventually, you start looking at it as like, oh, it does make sense to think like the dominance or like the systemic framework of it would slough off as internally the spirit of relationships grow. And in some ways you can maybe even read the interpretation that way. It'd be interesting to hear it in like the native language, because the one that I read is like the interpretation of what does it mean the world will fall apart, or does it mean the world will fall off in pieces, or does it mean like we'll eventually be free from that like overarching occupation of it, or something to that effect, or that once the message is not only just expanded and delivered to places, but understood, interpreted, that there's just going to be a ripple effect of it. It's just interesting. It's interesting to think about. It's also even more so because like I said, other people in different walks of life through different spiritual interpretive lenses are saying similar things. Like people are experiencing this shift of things happening, and they're putting language to it in similar ways. So on that note, there's a lot to say. This was like, I knew I had a lot to like unpack in my mind. I'm still kind of recovering from a cold, so kind of sniffly. But I think what's interesting is that we need to, like, people just also need to be reminded that through every season of spiritual change and growth, it always looks a little bit different than what people expect. And characters in the story always have a hard time discerning between what they're trying to preserve and what they should fight against, and where they need to surrender into. And they don't always get it right. Sometimes they're fighting the wrong people. They're battling who they perceive as the enemy. And they're not discerning where to like surrender into. And it's a little bit out of their definitions at the time. Think of Job, or think of other characters where they're like, I don't know what God's doing, but I feel like things crumbling, around me, and just kind of seeking where that shift is, like where that flow of direction is going. Because even remember, like the disciples, some of them like adamantly resisted Paul, and so that kind of gets to that stage where it seemed like you can kind of imagine Paul probably had this conviction of like I have to get this message into the vortex of where the world system is breaking out toward. And maybe he didn't even have the language for that, but he felt compelled to deliver it somewhere. And he brings it right into the middle of that vortex, and it sends it out into the world. And he basically like dies for that. And people even say like if it wasn't for Paul, then maybe the message wouldn't have even gone as far. It's hard to say because usually it finds some avenue somehow or another, but you can imagine at the time the church was probably like, no, we're just adhering to what we need to do here, and this is what we need to do. And some of that's correct. It's not like that was entirely incorrect. They had a difficult time probably discerning the shifting of those moments because it was correct. But you have to gauge what is the thing to do in step with the flow of where things are going in this other larger scale as well. And sometimes that seems to be like the tipping point. So I'm just kind of like thinking about that too, gauging the times, and this was a lot for me to talk through, but it does feel easier to get it out from my mind. On that note too, something that I would kind of suggest or thinking about is eventually I think people have to be prepared for both the benefit of looking at the benefit of institutions, but also I feel like we're kind of like pushing toward needing to understand the experience of life where we find our experience of God. And that's probably going to be challenging for people because they're going to be adamant that their only control measure and their only way to understand God is like institutions and things like that. And those aren't terrible things. We need, like our societies function by those things. It's just that God's not confined by them. But you could be a service to God through them, but it's not like, confined. But, in some ways, the way we find and refine how we learn and teach about God within institutions are through times where we're outside of them and we refine them simply by life. And so it seems like what we're finding now is like we have different religious groups that actually do have things to contribute. It's not so much like, well, which ones are wrong and then which like isolated one is correct, as much as like what portions are giving testimony to these other experiences, and how do we all refine then where we're at. Because there's so many aspects in society, in our shared existence, living as units, creatures that live and experience life through a unit system capacity, where almost everybody that's present and survived and has some level of resilience is contributing something. They're giving testimony to something, but we're just trying to refine some of the simple portions where we're not battling the wrong thing, resisting things unnecessary, or choosing the wrong battles and whatnot. And so as I'm thinking about that, what my mind goes to is needing to kind of understand and discern between a spiritual experience outside of the control of like some of those definitions. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I don't say that in the sense where I'm against other things as much as just how am I saying that? Just something I'm pondering, I guess, just imagining, just something to where if the going gets tough and people are really struggling and they're like, what am I like needing to let go of, or what am I not seeing? I guess it's just like in that context that I'm making reference to. Like if life is working for you, then you must be doing something right. But if you're working through like maybe caught up in some kind of struggle or battle, and you're like thinking that you're maybe wondering like, am I fighting the right battle? Am I choosing the wrong battle? Or how do I discern things? This is just what I'm pondering. This is where I'm pondering. So a lot of people that are in these conversations have followed these topics for a long time. They talk about spirituality. They talk about the world. They talk about, in some ways, like the end of religion, because it doesn't seem to be up to speed with the direction that innovation and the world is going. And so in some of those circles, what they're talking about is AI, artificial intelligence, right? Storming toward artificial intelligence. And what's interesting in those worlds, and I'm not as up to speed on those topics because there's just so much ground to cover on so many topics. But what's interesting in those topics, even theologians, a lot of theologians are studying this phenomenon because they are thinking that it's something they're maybe apprehensive or cautious about, wondering how to discern the absorbing of artificial intelligence into our lives, what that looks like for the future. But what's also interesting in that world of AI is that people are saying, and they're asking, what's the difference between components and a spirit or spirituality, or what animates life, or are we getting to the place where we're playing God, that kind of thing. And so this is kind of what I'm getting to. I'm trying to cover a lot of ground because I'm like getting to this. So this is kind of, if Martin Luther King put a bookmark on the globalization and the world is a neighborhood, and all these generations later, we're at the stage of what does that mean for the advancement on a global scale in terms of God, spirituality. Have we all put in our testimony and our chip? We've put our chips in, we've put our 2 cents in, and now on a world consciousness level, what do we think about God? So that's kind of what I'm talking about. Shared world consciousness. What do we think about God? And we're like racing toward this intersecting of events, and people are trying to figure that out. And so what's interesting to me, this is peculiar, right? Let's see how to summarize some of this strange stuff. We might be going down the vortex of philosophical, the physical world and the spiritual world, and how do we understand that? So what's interesting here is that some groups, those that study artificial intelligence, are really asking some of these legitimate questions as to when they try to track and map out existence, and even some atheist groups kind of wondering, what really is consciousness? What is the distinctive thing about humans? Where do we find this distinct animation that is life? And they had also said that eventually, according to their calculations, they can take everything that can be put into or described with words, as like a machine could basically fully incorporate and absorb that. And then eventually they're just finding that that would be the way we understand existence and whatnot. I find that so interesting, because then it's like, wow, that's even, seeming to be in scripture, where, so like in scripture, if you're familiar with scripture, the world becomes skewed, right? The world becomes skewed in the network of how they understand existence. Just a little bit off. God is still present, but we're not like connected, right? We're a little bit off. We're not quite understanding. We're not quite aligned. And so eventually we build these systems, right? Like in the story, like if you go way back to Genesis, what they get into is like these habits where they like build systems and the systems collapse, and they build a system and the system collapses. And they keep having this sense of trying to build a system and connect it to what they say, like the heavens, trying to align it to the heavens. And so they build these structures, they try to align it to the heavens, like they're trying to charge into heaven, or they're trying to resolve the heaven issue. And in some ways you could say, well, the heaven issue is probably like, what is the animation of life? How do we conquer the animation or the spirit of life? How do we understand it? How do we like reach it? How do we get there? How do we make that connection to heaven, or this spiritual experience, life, this mystery of life? So they keep having this pattern where like they're building this system, it collapses because it's not quite in alignment, or they build the wrong way and they build more in like a dominant sense, and then there's still such a separation from God. So anyway, eventually that story culminates in what they call the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel is this kind of story, old story in Genesis, where the people, it says, they come together with like this consciousness, telling themselves, we are going to connect to the heavens. We will reach the heavens, like we will be able to build for ourselves our path to God, to the heavens. So they build this like really high tower reaching towards the heavens. And then it says like, then God says something, goes down and sees and says, what are these people doing? This kind of reminds me of the ant story. Then God goes and sees what they're building and says, what are these people doing? Like, this is not a way to build sustainable life. And so he says, I must go down and give them each a different language so that they scatter, so that they cannot understand within that interpretation to keep rebuilding in this incorrect way. And so he disrupts their language, and so then they have to disperse, and then they each disperse, and they go, and then they build these separate their tendency is to rebuild, right? But they rebuild differently because they have different languages. It's hard for them to understand each other. Until eventually, long story, right? They will reemerge all together. Globalization, right? Eventually, they'll overcome those obstacles and they'll reemerge all together. And they will seek to resolve the division of language. And then what, right? So it's kind of just interesting when you think about the story, but it's also interesting in how it seems to converge with science now, where we've reemerged in globalization. We've negotiated between our different languages and groups and nations. We're still having a hard time doing that because we're still very much there's a lot of conflict in the world. But in the midst of that, then we have people saying, let's build ways to morph language and bring the words into some type of consensus where we resolve the mystery of life within everything that is encapsulated within words. That's also interesting too because just on another note, just the whole philosophy and theory of words is interesting because people say a lot about how there's so much about people that's body language, and communication is more complex than just words. There's certain timing and references. There's ways that people use words with layers where they mean maybe something is polite, and then there's this undercurrent of something else that they actually mean, and there's interpretive stuff that goes on between there. So even in light of language, that's interesting to think about. But on another note, in scripture, it's interesting that in some of the texts, so the book of John is something that people will kind of say he's a little bit more spirit. He speaks more in the language of spirituality or mysticism or things like that. Some people like the book of John because of that. Maybe some don't because of that. But I think it's in John where it says, it makes reference to things like the word became flesh. Words became flesh and dwelt among them. So a lot of times if people kind of have these interpretive approaches to Jesus, they think, well, that just means the incarnation of Jesus, where Jesus became a man and dwelt among the people, God visited us in flesh, or God becomes flesh. I know some people in other groups were kind of in the middle of these discussions about, well, what does that mean? Does it actually mean that Jesus was God, and then so God became a man? Or does it mean that so there's these other groups. So we're trying to negotiate between religions, right? We're trying to negotiate between Islam and Judaism, and a variety of other religious beliefs have different opinions about Jesus. So that's what we're kind of getting to as well. That'll probably be another discussion, but I'm just saying, I'm having that in mind as I'm saying this. We could still account for the scriptures and the gospels and the story, but also shift it to where we look at some of those things maybe differently, or we work through it, or we're open to working through it. And so some of the suggestion is that Jesus actually, in reference to the incarnation, is speaking about his spirit being housed in the temple. He's likened to the temple, and our flesh is like the temple. And so what they're talking about is not necessarily that Jesus was God, and then God became fully human in that same type of sense, as much as the mediator between these worlds could be something to the effect of like God created a way to bring understanding through the temple, through the vessel of the temple, and that our spirit is housed in our fleshly temple, and that's what becomes manifest. That's what the revelation is, that Jesus has the Spirit of God manifest through the fleshly temple, the temple of our body, like, so it's like when it says God in the flesh, maybe it means the Spirit of God manifesting through the temple, through the vessel of our body. And kind of like, so you still have the language of like the incarnation, but it's just, we're looking at it differently. And it could be that it lines up, maybe we could try that on and like think about that. But what's also interesting about that is if you're thinking like the word becomes flesh and dwells among man, or brings that understanding or that revelation to man, it is interesting to think about it along those lines of saying like through this process of these stories, the symbol of these stories and the revelation of the temple and some of these things, then we get an understanding. It's through those things where the understanding becomes flesh and dwells within us. So like the understanding, the revelation becomes like a part of the indwelling of our understanding, I guess, something to that effect, how I'm trying to say that. Or as it says, like the words become flesh and like dwell among us. So what's also interesting about some of this is eventually just the idea that it seems to suggest too that we should be able to understand the revelation of spiritual connection personally to ourselves and what those mechanisms are, like God dwelling within us as we manifest a way that we develop and live our lives as being the place where God resides, like how it says in the scripture, like being the temple. And so it's just kind of interesting to think of like the long story. I was going to go into this too. There's just a lot of topics to kind of cover that are kind of going in all these different directions, where people are talking about the character of Jesus, and it does pertain to like Judaism as to it's a significant portion because Jesus reveals like kind of fulfilling the temple. The temple then is this like representation of understanding the indwelling of God in the vulnerabilities, like kind of in the city square, like people had difficulty understanding centering unto God because they had to negotiate between the people and themselves, which is like a expression of the temple and ourselves. And so it just seems like our ability to have that spiritual connection in our lives would reside outside of us, like in a temple or through deliberation with like a holy person, or things like that, which there's a time and place for. Like we're social creatures and there's stages where we need to learn and grow, but ultimately what it reveals though is this like culmination of we are created in this image of spiritual beings, and ultimately God resides within us, and we refine the way that becomes expressed through our body and our physical being. And so it's just kind of, I think, important to understand those stages. Is like it's something I'd made reference to online before, that like we do try to be how would you say, like understanding within religious and cultural expressions and interpretations and whatnot, but then there also is this sense where religious claims can be detrimental because like on a world stage, what people think that they're fighting for, and it can really eventually get outside of like God's intent or God's ideal and stuff like that. And it's also at a time though where we have to think about, because it's on the world stage too, is like, what do people mean then when they're talking about Jesus and what Jesus actually represented, and what does that mean for us when the world system seems to be kind of struggling and not always, people not giving themselves the freedom to bypass some of the claims of the dominant system, to work out peaceful measures where we have opportunity to do that amongst other groups because they're adhering to these certain frameworks and certain ideas and whatnot. And among those ideas are, how do you think about Jesus? What do you actually think happened there? What was Jesus representing? Like, it is just not accurate. It just doesn't seem accurate to look at some of the struggles in the U.S. where it seems more than obvious that we've, come so far to heal from some like historic wrongs from or pertaining to religion, but also intermixed within people getting it wrong and attacking the wrong groups and all or nothing, and this framing of different sides, and instead of seeing what was a revelation where God was at work in other people's lives, other people groups, And what I find also interesting, among so many other things, but what's interesting about those stories among the tribes, for one, is that it gives testimony that God was at work within tribal people, within their spiritual practices, within their calling, within the context of their lives, that God spiritually visited them, that God used them, and that's different than what you hear within history, where some like religious fanatics would, have this language that they're bringing some kind of they're bringing God to people instead of expecting that God works and functions through a variety of people's lives throughout the world. And they just kind of want to interpret it as like one side or the other. Like, God's not working in your life until you heard about Jesus in the Bible and stuff like that. And now that I bring this up, it's just such a long topic to have, it's so ingrained in how people think. It's kind of like, well, what are you saying then? Are you saying so this is where people get really confused. I feel like they don't know how to think that Jesus is this unique character, but at the same time, God is already at work in other people's lives. And how do we view this God at work in other people's lives and the unique message of Jesus? And people kind of want to think either or. And how do we approach that? And how is that different than saying that? Are you saying that every religion is a way that like God's at work within people, or and so we're kind of at the stage in history where even bringing that up, it's just like people don't, that's not how they generally have learned about Jesus. And so you can just see it's just very pervasive in the way people look at the dominant system. They think that through the dominant system and its connection on the world stage that they are preserving God, and if they lose that, then they lose God, and they think it's this holy battle that they're preserving and fighting, and everyone else is the enemy, and they have to be converted in this certain way, and it's either them, like Jesus is the only way, and we can't give an inch to any of their other cultural contributions. And so it goes through this whole thing, right? And it's like kind of a major battle that we're having now, where people don't seem to give themselves that like spiritual freedom to say, hey, let's negotiate across the way with these other people groups and cultures and religious contributions, and they just, to them, that's heresy. So where do we go with that? How do we think about that? In a simple way, I think maybe this is why it's important for us to also look at how are we actually interpreting what Jesus did in the scriptures. And I think it's really important to look at a lot of the symbolism, some of the main portions that even make Jesus manifest is the temple and the symbolism and the representation of the temple. Even the use of like so many things. This is like a whole other conversation, a massive conversation on the topics of like sons of God and the temple and inheritances of God and the bridge between earth and heaven. And all of this has to do significantly as pertaining to Jesus through the temple. And so I'll just kind of say that without unpacking all of it, just because that's like a whole theological conversation topic. But basically saying Jesus is significant because of the symbolism of the temple. And the temple is massively transformative because it's situated in the world systems. And so when you think about it like that, what you're finding is like, what did Jesus reveal? Like through that story, Jesus revealed that God is within people. And that the way that we refine our lives and the way we're situated on the world stage, as we work through those, we find that our ability to align to that kind of God spark within us is better, is functioning better. And even the message of atonement and things like that has to do with like systems and dominions and things along those lines. And those systems and dominions barring us from living in more of that spiritual freedom. That is our spiritual inheritance, as we live among the Spirit of God, like we're creatures in connection to the Spirit of God. And so when you think about it like that, then you're realizing that there is freedom to go and expand across the earth and to proclaim, or to practice the freedom of spiritual connection. Jesus says, like he is the temple and God resides within, etc., etc. But then what we also find is that it's this testimony that in the midst of this ultimate goal to heal the world from improper dominions and forces and systems, that you can grow as a unit, you can grow as a life unit, and in the midst of these systems and internally to transform them, And along those lines, there is this unique revelation that Jesus does have in terms of transforming the temple in the midst of this whole strategy to transform world systems, and then to practice those spiritual connections with people and whatnot. And so when you look at it like that, you realize that people should have room then to simply just practice developing those relationships and meeting people in their cultural framework to develop those types of connections and then refine it from there. And but you do also find though, even though there are better and worse stories, it had become pervasive though, just how people interpret scripture and impose things or create divisions where it's not necessary, or pick the wrong battles, and we see people struggle with that. In some ways, the very way that people try to promote and say Jesus is the only way, and they do it adamant that they're fighting the right battle, and they're using that as to create an improper division among other groups, where they're actually supposed to use it as being empowered to develop those connections with other groups. And so there's just a lot of things along those lines that just midst of it create more turmoil and improper divides and whatnot. Because in some ways what you're saying is ultimately what Jesus reveals is the destructiveness of these improper dominions and improper powers and improper divides. And so sometimes when people are saying, well, Jesus is the only way, they're doing the very thing that revelation is supposed to be like healing. And they're using it to improperly divide and refuse mutuality and create up improper dominions and some of the very things that the message is against. And so anyway, there's a lot more to say. I feel like I'm kind of like needing to take a break, and I do feel like I've kind of settled some of the main points that I was lingering on and thinking about. I guess a simple note, because of a lot of the conflicts going on the world stage now, I do feel like some of it is like the result of some of the improper world dominion approaches. And you just see that by the effects. You see that people are intensifying fighting the wrong battle, improperly defending the dominant system, not sure how to shift from wanting to be in step with like doing right by God and spirituality, but not knowing how to discern between improper divides that this chasm of like divides between groups, and they just kind of self-justify it. They pick the wrong battle, and then as the battle intensifies and people argue their points, maybe they argue their points farther and farther out, but people are holding ground because they know that there's not a breakthrough of mutuality. And there's something correct about that. Even though people can say, well, we have proof that they're fighting the wrong battle and they're getting into these battles, it's like, well, are you doing the other thing though? Like, it's likely, if you're fighting the wrong battle, that you're intensifying the pressure of the dominant system, or you're not seeing the opportunities for mutuality. You're improperly using the divide between Christianity and misusing the idea of Jesus being this one way. You're not living in more of the freedom of what Jesus revealed in terms of letting go of some of these other like you can have the benefit of some religious practice. I'm not against that. It's useful to have those things, but are you also giving freedom to recognize and even expect? Some people don't even expect to see a spiritual mutuality among other groups that they don't see as automatically through the lens of a practice of Jesus. And it's some of these things where it's difficult for them to do that, and they're going to think they're fighting the right battles, and they're going to think that when they provoke tensions among other groups where they don't discern other opportunities, they're going to tend to think that they're correct, and they're going to intensify those divides even more. And so it's difficult to enter into those situations and say, hey, well, have you ever thought you're picking the wrong battle? And I think that's kind of where I try to understand things from different angles, and then there's time to do some interpretive work between various ones. And so there are various topics that I'm wanting to contribute to or be a part of, and so you kind of see that taking place as well. It is something where it's not so much that we want to say anything goes, or that there aren't better different, better ways to do things, or what have you. But it's also just this shift of like, there really is a revelation. There's like a freedom through even like the teachings of Jesus, where there's certain universal values that you can understand and recognize. And it's not so much these harmful ways of looking at religion as almost, like very dehumanizing, and assuming like some people are just like, certain groups are just void of some contribution to God, or things like that, or void of some type of life contribution. But it's all these things. It's kind of like a vulnerable negotiation to make, because there are certain things we kind of have to solve for, almost like the equation in the unit of life, where we are looking at like a free system, and we are looking at what it means to shift toward this even more free economy, so that people have the ability for work out those attributes of like their personal spirituality, basically like not having slavery and things like that, and then also just kind of solving for the acceptance that we're refining God within people, that God resides within people. We do have the opportunity and the benefit of creating institutions and things by which we can express and manage and like make some of the benefits and outcomes of life more efficient and whatnot. But it just doesn't mean that it encapsulates and controls and issues access to God. That we shift into accepting that the revelation is like people, we innately are a part of this connection to God, and we need to refine it. We like surface that more in our lives. And then you realize like what inhibits that is like things that happen to us in life, or like the system's encroachment or occupying forces, and like we work through that and we refine that. And so when people approach that kind of backwards, and they think you don't have God, and we're going to inflict the system on you until you have God, it's such a backwards way of looking at it. It's like you're supposed to have the revelation where you recognize God within people, you build that up and edify it, and that in turn sloughs off the occupying systemic forces so that we live in a more freed system. But to do the very opposite of what that revelation is, and to try to strong arm people into thinking that's what the revelation is, like this is the one way, and accept it, is such a backwards way of trying to proclaim what the message even is. But anyway, so just me kind of looking through a lot of these things. And another topic along these lines is like just looking at how do we then approach some of these stages of conflict. And then that kind of gets into like on the world stage, we're looking at the collision of a lot of different conflicts, right? How do you like kind of discern between the collision of these conflicts? If you look at what some of the outcomes should be, that we accept that God is innately within us, that we align, that we can encourage certain forms of freedom in society where people have the freedom to accept that level of a living attribute of refining God within you, aligned to God, a healthy functioning society, life sources and expressions of life. Then we can look at, then what's generating some of these conflicts in the world. And some of them are actually types of holy war, where certain ones are still vying. They're generating some of these problems because they're refusing to see the mutuality in other groups, which is not a testimony to God. They're refusing to see the testimony of God residing within people. And so they're fighting over which temples have, like occupying type forces or access and things along those lines. That's not to say that temples are never relevant. They're beautiful expressions. They can be a testimony. It's just saying that it doesn't control who innately has access to God, and who can control the appearance of the access through occupying forces and stuff like that. And so when we're looking at like the throes of tension going on in the globe, and we're looking at how do we get some of these other outcomes, these societal freedoms, these acceptance of the testimony of mutuality, shifting how we think about Jesus and whatnot, then you're seeing that some of these battles in the world are because people are seeing a system that they think is supposed to have these certain powers, are realizing that they're losing those powers. And so people are kind of discerning, like, well, where do we go with this? How do we look at what the outcome should be? And how do we look at religion and the future? And so anyway, those are some of the topics that I am just thinking about. So when these topics come up, this is an example of so many other things behind the scenes that I'm thinking about in reference to these topics. And it goes into a lot of other things too. Then people will say, well, how do we think about corrective measures over time, or starting in on these conversations, or degrees of progress or degrees of critique, as we look at world culture. And so anyway, we've kind of talked about that. And as I was saying, on some level, like there are some things that if you kind of have that standard of universal human rights and negotiating between groups in various contexts, and, like implying those stages of like equalizing at least some degree of the recognition of life and whatnot, then you kind of start having these standards of how to like make improvement or pick your battles, or there's a lot of things, I think sometimes some people just, no matter how much you try to negotiate, until it just doesn't work and the spirit shifts somewhere, they just are not going to want to hear it. And I kind of think that's maybe a little bit of what the Apostle Paul was saying, and he's like, very sadly and lamenting that he strongly believes things are shifting in this other way, and if people don't recognize it, they're going to feel like they're going to feel like it's all for nothing. Because they're going to have the pieces and the definitions and the components, and they're going to be trying to keep putting them back together when the source of it and the force of life, the path is like flowing in this other direction. And it's kind of like Paul is saying, I wish, because I don't want all of your efforts to feel like a waste. I don't want the world to fall around you and that you just fall apart. Like, I wish that you would recognize those pieces and the portions and like connect and like flow into this place where things are kind of going, and choose your battles differently and surrender into like some of these things. So anyway, I guess that's just such a long audio journal. It was really helpful for me, though. I do feel like I've put pieces of files that were just kind of swarming in my mind together really long think I'll leave it at that for now. That was a lot to say, a lot to think about, and a lot to digest. So I think I'm just going to leave it there for now, and there'll be some other topics that I'll pick up on. And yeah, so